Hello, my name is Anil Shrestha and I'm a professor in the Plant Science Department at California State University, Fresno. In this video, we are going to talk about integrated weed management in vegetable production systems. Although I say vegetable production systems, the principles I will talk about will be applicable to many other cropping systems, so it's not just limited to vegetable production systems. So the first question that comes to our mind is, why do we have weeds in our cropping systems? Are they there because something we did not control them? Whatever we applied, whether it be herbicides or mechanical control, did they not control those weeds, or is there something else that is causing weeds to be present? Now we have to remember that we created our farmlands from natural ecosystems, which is designed for high species diversity. So we cleared the natural vegetation and we created a more simplified system that we call agroecosystems. In this system, the species diversity is low, but nature tries to bring back the system to what it was originally, and it is designed for high species diversity and covered ground. That's the law of nature. So we are fighting against this nature's law, and we create systems such as this one you see. It's a solo cropping system, and then such systems leave room for invasion, and those invasions we call as weeds. So we are fighting this law of nature. Just as an example, let me show you how things work in nature. So let's just say you cleared a piece of land and made it fallow. If you leave it alone, don't do anything, you're going to see annual species of plants or so-called weeds starting to show up. You leave it further, you'll see biennials, perennials starting to show up. And then if you leave it further without disturbing it, you'll start to see shrubs and bushes. So this whole process will continue till we reach the climax situation, and this process is called ecological succession. Now again, ecological succession is a natural continuous process of change in the species over time. So this is what we are up against in our agricultural systems, trying to fight the nature's law of ecological succession. So how do we go about managing or competing against this ecological succession? It is a challenge, and this is why we have weeds. So again, the question is, where do these seeds come from to start the process of ecological succession? And for this, I'm going to introduce you to a term called the weed seed bank. The seed bank in the soil is the source of weeds. So here we are talking about not a bank for money, but where the seeds are stored. That's in the soil, and we call it the weed seed bank. And the weeds start their life cycle from a single seed, and if you let them go, they will produce more seeds, and the seeds will go back to the seed bank. So it is a continuous process. Unless we are able to reduce the weed seed bank, we will be fighting these weeds over and over again every year. So that is why knowledge about weed seed bank is important. And here you can see a lot of seedlings are emerging, they're germinating, emerging, and you can also see the seeds on the surface of the soil. So these are all the seeds that were in the seed bank now starting to germinate and emerge. So seed bank management, or an understanding of seed banks, is very important. And we also have another term called weed budbank. Now the seed bank is for reference to annual crops that produce or reproduce by seeds. But then there are perennial plants that can reproduce by other structures. By other structures, I mean other than seeds, such as rhizomes, tubers, bulbs, stolons. These are all vegetative structures, and there's another terminology I'm going to use, and that is bud bank. So the seed bank refers to the seeds, whereas the bud bank refers to the reproductive structures such as rhizomes, tubers, and bulbs and stolons that you see in the slide here. Okay, so what I just introduced are probably some new terms for you, or you may have heard it before, the seed bank and the bud bank. So what exactly happens to the seeds and the buds in the seed bank? So they're there in the seed bank and they're usually dormant, and once dormancy is broken, they germinate, and if you let them grow and reproduce, they will produce seeds, and the seeds will fall off the plants back into the seed bank or bud bank. And this process, if the seeds are falling off the plant, is called seed rain. So not a rain from the sky, but rain from the plants. So then there may be other modes of dispersion. So the seed rain is not the only way that seeds get into the soil seed bank. There are other methods or dispersal mechanisms that can bring weed seeds from other places, such like the wind, irrigation, or even tractors that move from one field to the other. Now, there are only certain ways that the seeds can be removed from the seed bank. One is if they germinate, then they are removed from the seed bank because they become a plant, or they can be predated by insects or other organisms, but this is just a small portion of the seed removal from the seed bank. Others may fail to germinate, and that may be because of pathogens, or they may be buried too deep in the soil, or there may be any other environmental conditions that cause them to not germinate. And sometimes the seeds are damaged physically by implements like tractors, or they just die a physiological death. So all the green letters that you see are the ways that the seeds can be removed from the seed bank, but they're not a lot. They don't remove the seeds a lot. So you have to fight the seed rain. That means in the first place you got to prevent the weeds from producing seeds and sending them back to the seed bank. So at Fresno State, we do some studies in our weeds lab section where students look at seed banks and they try to understand the seed bank.
Hello, my name is Daniel Nares. I'm a senior at the Plant Science Department here at Fresno State.
Hi, my name is Andrea Contreras. I'm a senior here at the Plant Science Department at Fresno State.
In my weed science class lab, we're learning about the weed seed bank. Learning about the weed seed bank is important for integrated weed management because it provides us with an idea of weed pressure in a field as well as the potential weed species that we may come across. Helping with this information, we will create a plan to develop an effective weed management plan.
So now that we have learned about the weed seed bank, let's start talking about what happens after the seed germinates. So here you see a field that is a vegetable field with weeds starting to emerge. So let's talk about the life cycle of weeds. Now this is a generalized view of the life cycle of weeds. So let's say you start, or the plant starts in this case, with a seed or the vegetative propagule. It germinates. After the dormancy is broken, it becomes a seedling. If you let it grow, it's going to go to the vegetative stage. If you let it go further, it will go to the reproductive stage, produce seeds, and the plant will start to senesce and produce more seeds that go back to the seed bank. So the window of opportunity for control before the seedling becomes established is what we call pre-emergence control. So that is your window to control the small emerging seedlings, and that is pre-emergence control. Once the seedling becomes established, then you can control it up to the vegetative stage by post-emergence control methods. If you have failed to control the weeds at the vegetative stage, then they are going to go to the reproductive stage. Now you can still control them with mechanical tools or even chemicals at the reproductive stage, but here is where you should be more focused on seed bank management. In other words, you should think about not letting those plants that are flowering actually produce seeds, and that seed is just going to go and add to the seed bank. So basically, I have divided the weed management program into 3 different stages: pre-emergence, post-emergence, and seed bank management stages. So the question now is, are herbicides or hand weeding the only option for weed control? Obviously not. We have many tools for weed control, and we call it the use of many little hammers for weed management, and this is a term that was coined by Liebman and Gallant in 1997. This is integrated weed management, where we use many tools available to us for managing weeds. So here is a technical definition for integrated weed management. It is a holistic approach to weed management that integrates different methods of weed control to provide the crop with an advantage over weeds. So here we are not talking about total elimination of the weed, but more of a management perspective, because integrated weed management has the potential to restrict the weed populations to a manageable level, and it reduces the environmental impact of the different weed management practices we use. It increases the cropping system's sustainability, and over the long run, it reduces the selection pressure for weed resistance to herbicide. So we have just now introduced the term integrated weed management, which again is the use of many little tools for controlling weeds. So now, what are the tools? We can divide the tools into physical, cultural, chemical, and biological methods. These are all strategies for controlling weeds. Now, this is not just a strategy for weed management, but in general for pest management, be it insect pests, fungus. It can be used as an integrated tool for management of other types of pests as well. But here I'm only going to focus on management of weeds. So now there's another thing that I want to point out. The reality is, like many people, when they find out that if a certain system is working, people tend to stay with that system, and then the weeds adapt to that system. So if you use the same practice continuously over time, weeds will adapt to that particular system. So the idea is to rotate these management methods. Here, for example, if you only use mowing, I'm just using it as an example, if you use mowing as the only tool, you will have species that adapt to mowing or are not controlled by mowing. The ones that grow close to the ground, prostrate, they are not susceptible to mowing, because the mower does not control them. Mower is a little bit higher than where they grow, so they will take over and become the dominant weed. So now that is an introduction to integrated weed management, but here you have to understand that there are principles that dictate integrated weed management, or are components of integrated weed management, such as tillage, critical periods for weed control, alternate methods of weed control, and so on. I'm not going to discuss each of these in detail, but I will discuss a few of these components of integrated weed management. So let's start with the critical period of competition, which is a very important component or concept in integrated weed management. Now, critical period of competition is the period where you have to keep the crop weed free to avoid irreversible damage through competition. So in other words, there is only a certain phase in the crop's life cycle that is more susceptible to weeds, and other times they may not be as susceptible to competition, but it depends on the crop. So there are two important concepts now to talk about, and there are length and duration of competition. This is called the critical weed-free period requirement. Is the minimum amount of time that you have to keep your crop or field weed-free to prevent yield loss. So that's one component of the critical period. But then there's another component which we call the weed competition period. That is the maximum amount of time the weeds can be allowed to compete with the crop without reducing yield loss. Now, this can be confusing, but let me explain it in more detail on what I mean by weed-free requirement and weed competition period. So let's talk about the first component, the weed-free requirement. So the first question we ask is, how long must the crop be kept weed-free to prevent crop yield loss? So that is one way of asking about the critical weed-free period. So weeds that emerge after that weed-free requirement may actually not cause any yield losses, but then you have to be aware of the weeds maybe not competing with the crop, but they may be growing and producing seeds, and they may go back to the seed bank and build your seed bank. But I hope you understand what the weed-free requirement means now. Now, we still have another component to think about for the critical period, and that is, how long can you allow the weeds to remain in the field before they cause irreversible effects on yield? So here's a situation of a farmer who was thinking, let all the weeds germinate and emerge, and then I will control it. So this is what we call the weed competition period. But how long can you let the weeds stay in the field before they cause yield losses? So this is the second component of critical period for weed competition, to be more precise. So here is another picture showing that component, or two components I should say. The first component that I talked about is, how long should we keep, as you see in the picture that says A, how long should we keep the weed out of the system and then stop weeding? Then the other system or component B, where you have another approach saying let the weeds emerge and then I will control it. But regardless of whether you take approach A or approach B, there is a certain period during the life cycle of the crop where weeds cannot be tolerated, otherwise there will be weed related crop losses. So this is what we call the critical period for weed control, and I hope this concept now makes sense to you. So again, to kind of summarize what the critical period for weed competition is, it is the time interval between the weed-free requirement and the weed competition period to avoid yield loss. And I have the text there for a complete definition of what the critical period for weed competition is. So I hope this has helped you understand the two components of the critical period for weed control. And at Fresno State, students learn about these concepts about the critical weed-free period and the critical weed-free requirement. And here are some students explaining their experiments that they are doing during the weed science class lab exercises.
Hello, my name is Juan Magaña and I'm a plant science major at Fresno State. During this weed science lab, we are conducting an experiment to view the critical weed-free period in this lettuce plot.
Hello, my name is Gabriela Rios and I am a plant science major at Fresno State. The goal of this experiment is to determine how long we have to keep the lettuce plots weed-free before we see yield and quality loss.
Hi, my name is Jasmine Flores. I am a senior here at Fresno State in the plant science department. The critical control period for weeds is important because it helps us save on costs for weeding. We should also be aware that weeds set seeds that can add to the weed seed bank.
So in this video, we have been talking about integrated weed management, and what the students just showed you is this experiment on critical period for weed control in lettuce, which is an important component of integrated weed management. And Jasmine also mentioned that although the critical period may be over, but you have to worry about weeds that come in later and can add to the seed bank. So now that you have an understanding of the critical period for weed control, let's move on. And before we move on from critical weed free period, here's a chart showing how long certain crops, and I've included only vegetable crops, have to be kept weed free to avoid yield loss. So you can read the slide there in the critical period for each of those crops. So again, let's go back to integrated weed management, and let's start talking about some of these methods of weed control. So let's start with cultural weed control. Cultural weed control means use of agronomic practices or a land management practice that favors plants over weeds. So here you are manipulating the crop weed situation for desirable, in a sense that the crop has an advantage over the weed. So you can do that in many ways, and I'll show you some examples of how we could do that. So cultural weed control includes prevention, and that is sanitation, keeping the field edges clean, and seed bank obviously is one of the management of the seed bank is obviously one of the preventive strategies. Crop rotation, increasing crop competitiveness, stale bait techniques, pre-irrigation techniques, cover crops, intercrops, irrigation systems, variety selections, and other methods. These are all part of cultural weed control, and I'm going to discuss them or show you visually some of these control methods. So let's start with prevention. Prevention, we already talked about it a lot during the seed bank portion of this video. If we prevent the introduction of new species and seeds, buds, you already have a good management system in place. Now, you can prevent the movement of weed seed and infested crop material, sometimes from one field to the other or from other places. And you can begin by using certified weed seed free crop seeds, because some of the crop seeds can be infested with weed seeds, and you just introduce new species to your field. So reducing the weed seed bank, I want to emphasize this over and over again, is a very important strategy in integrated weed management. Now you can also manage weeds along field edges, or you should manage the weeds along field edges, because they can add to the seed bank. You can minimize weed escapes by clipping the weeds. You can bury the seeds deeper into the soil profile by using tillage equipment. And let me also tell you that weed seeds can also be introduced with manure. So the manure has to be properly composted so that the seeds are not alive. Otherwise, if you use raw manure, they may add seeds to the seed bank. If you're using irrigation systems, the water supply or the canal banks, you have probably seen, have weeds growing next to them, and they add seeds to the water, and that water comes into your field through irrigation, and that can add to your problem as well. Using clean equipment, farm equipment, is important, and many times we forget that after we harvest our crops, the season is over, maybe not, because the weeds are still growing and they are producing seeds, and they will go back to the seed bank. So post-harvest management after you harvest the crops is important in terms of weeds. And you can even use crop rotations and herbicide rotations These are all part of the strategies for reducing the weed seed bank. So here's a situation where you have a lot of weeds on the edges of the field. Now, many times we think that nothing's going to happen here in terms of wheat crop competition, but you have to remember that these weed seeds can move into the field through wind or your equipment. So it's always a good idea to keep the field edges and borders clean so that we don't add to the weed seed bank. I already discussed about using manure that has been composted so that you don't add weed seeds or live seeds, I should say, with raw manure into the field. Canal bags, as I said earlier, can have a lot of weeds growing next to it. The seeds fall off the plants, fall in the water, and can come into your fields through irrigation. So you can use filters to stop the weed seeds from entering the field. So these are again many little hammers of integrated weed management. Also, you should sanitize or clean the tractors and equipment when you move equipment from one field to the other so that you don't move weed seeds around. So cleaning of equipment and vehicles are also equally important. And many times we harvest the crop. As you can see in this field, the crop has been harvested and now you have a solid stand of weeds still growing and going to produce seeds that is going to go back. They're all going to go back to the seed bank. So post-harvest weed management is also very, very important. Now crop rotation is a very old practice, and here's an example of what crop rotation is. Here you're rotating tomato and broccoli. That means this year you grow tomato, next year you grow broccoli, and so on. So this practice breaks up the weeds life cycle. In other words, the weeds are not able to adapt to the system properly as opposed to growing the same crop over and over again. So crop rotation is a major cultural technique, and if you grow the same crop again and again, year after year, the weeds will adapt to that particular system. So rotating crops will break the life cycle of the weeds. And again, it's not going to get rid of all your weeds, but at least it is one of those many little tools. Now, you can also use herbicides in rotation when you use different crops. But then you have to be aware of a term called plant back restriction, and that has to do with herbicides. And I'm not going to deal or talk about herbicides in this particular video. So how do you increase the competitiveness of the crop? Now there are many ways you can do that. You can adjust your planting dates so that you have a head start over the weeds, using transplants instead of direct seeded vegetables. In the case of vegetable production systems, you can decrease row width so that the area between the rows are shaded and does not allow the weeds to establish or grow properly. You can increase seeding rates in certain crops, and you can also use techniques like stale seed bed, pre-irrigation, and other irrigation techniques that I will just show you some pictures of. So stale seed beds mean where you let the beds over after you harvest a crop. So you let it alone, you let the weed seeds emerge or germinate and emerge, and then you control them after they emerge. Another technique that people have used, vegetable growers do use, is pre-irrigation, where the fields are irrigated before the crop is planted. This system allows the weeds to emerge. As you can see here, the weeds have emerged, and then you can control them either using mechanical tools or chemical tools. So now you have eliminated quite a lot of the weeds that were in the seed bank, and then you plant the crop. So here you again have an advantage for the crop over the weeds. So this is another technique. Cover crops, which are becoming popular. Here's a field showing cover crop. This happens to be triticale. The grower grows it over the winter, then terminates it, before planting the next crop, and you can see that a lot of weeds are suppressed even without using any mechanical or chemical methods. This is a tomato field after the cover crop. So quite a fair bit of weed control using cover crops as well. Then many farmers, especially in smallholder systems, do use intercropping, as you can see here, and where instead of having weeds grow between the rows, you have another crop, a vegetable crop growing between the rows. So it also helps in weed suppression. And then irrigation systems, most of the time when water shortages were not a problem, the fields were irrigated with sprinklers and flood irrigation, but now we are starting to convert to subsurface drip and surface drip irrigation, and that also has implications for weed control. As you can see in the flood irrigated field, there are a lot of weeds, whereas in the subsurface drip irrigated field, you don't see so many weeds. That is because the drip tape is buried 10 inches below the bed, in this case on the left side, and that drip tape only provides water to the crop row, so the weeds between the rows are deprived of water and the seeds do not germinate, or even if they germinate and emerge, they die because there is not much water there. So again, a very effective tool in weed control. So here you see a situation where furrow irrigated on the left has a lot of weeds in between the rows, whereas subsurface drip does not have that many weeds. And that is a picture of a field before a cultivation tool was applied. So as you can see, the drip irrigated field probably did not even require to be cultivated. So that's another tool. Some cultivars, such as tomatoes, there are tomato cultivars that are resistant to dodder, whereas some are not resistant, and you can see the difference between the two. Not a lot of crops are there, or very few crops are there that have these types of varieties that are resistant to certain weeds. Dodder, by the way, is a parasitic weed. So the plant attaches, the weed in this case attaches to the crop and takes the nutrients and photosynthase from the plant. So that's another tool. So hopefully I gave you an overview of some of the cultural practices that you can apply for weed control in vegetable production systems. Now I'm going to move on to physical weed control methods that include burning, flaming, steaming, mulching, and soil solarization. So let's look at these methods. Burning, many people burn their fields after the crop is harvested to kill the weed seeds. Now this is not allowed everywhere. There are regulations against this because of air quality concerns, but it was one of the tools for weed control. And now, like, it's not encouraged because of air quality regulations. Nevertheless, it is still a method of weed control. Here's a picture of a student flaming using a hand backpack flamer. Now, it's a propane flamer. I must make the point that you should not stand and burn the whole weed. A few seconds of the flame is enough to kill the weed. As long as the cell walls are broken and disrupted, the weeds will die. So you don't have to stand and burn the weed down to residue or something like that. So something to remember. Then steam. Some of the new tools are now being used for weed control, and here's an example of a steam weed control machine. So it's effective against certain weed species. So another tool, mulching, which is a very old technique, and there are different kinds of mulches available, and here you can see plastic mulches, recycled paper mulches on display. So they are an effective control method, and they fall under the physical weed control category. Solarization is another technique where you use clear plastic, and the process is usually done in the hot periods during the summer where the sunlight is very intense, and these kill the weed seeds in the seed bank. Now, one thing I should mention is you have to set aside at least about 8 weeks for the solarization process to work. So you are setting aside your field for solarization and not growing a crop. So some people cannot afford to set aside land during summer. So that was your physical methods that I just showed you. Now let's move on to mechanical weed control method, which seems to be gaining a lot of momentum because of the rise in herbicide resistant weeds. So let's look at these one at a time. Mechanical weed control, as you can see on the slide there, ranges from hand pulling all the way to the latest robotic techniques that we have for weed control in recent years. So mechanical weed control is a practice of controlling weeds with implements or machinery. And before herbicides were discovered, mechanical methods were primarily done by growers for weed control. Now, because of resurgence in mechanical control in recent years, there is more interest in mechanical control. And I'll show you some robotic tools that have been developed over the years, in recent years, that have added to our arsenal of mechanical weed control tools. So what are the benefits of using mechanical weed control? They can be less expensive than other methods. They can be combined with other farm operations, and you can get rid of herbicide resistant weeds if you have herbicide use in your fields and you have developed or seen herbicide resistant weeds. And there's less concern of water quality issues, because water quality issues generally rise because of pre-emergence herbicides or herbicides in general that end up in the groundwater or surface water. So mechanical weed control eliminates that possibility of herbicides, because you are not using herbicides in the large context of mechanical weed control. So let's look at some of the methods, and I'm going to start with hand pulling, which is, by the way, a part of mechanical weed control. So here's a student looking after his plots, and he's actually pulling out the weeds by hand. Now let's see what he has to say.
Weeding is the oldest and the most proven way of weed management, but in California we have a lot of regulations against it. It is much more useful against annuals than perennials, as the perennials have a different root system. But even for the smaller plots, it is definitely very useful, but it is very laborious for the weeder.
So you see, as the student was saying, hand pulling is an old proven technology and is effective, but it is very laborious. The next technique is hand hoeing, and this is the technique that's still being used in many parts of the world, and it's used regularly in vegetable crops along with the mechanical tools or herbicides. In many parts of the world, as I said, is the only method for weed control. And perennial crops, I should say perennial weeds in this case, can also be hand hoed and controlled. But the problem is you cannot go very close to the crops, such as lettuce, with these hand hoes, because there is a danger that the hose, while you are hoeing, may damage the crop as well. So you have to be careful while hand hoeing. So the other problem with hand hoeing is weeds that are smaller than 2 inches can be easily missed, and sometimes the weeds look like the crop, so you need trained eyes to actually distinguish the crop from the weed. And I already mentioned that the hand hose in this case can damage the crop. It's laborious, it's very expensive, and short handled hose were banned in California in 2004. There are some regulations around hand pulling and hand hoeing that you may be aware of or should be aware of. So then there are many different ways of controlling weeds by mowing and cutting. So there are certain weeds that are controlled better with mowing and cutting, but those weeds that have their growing points very close to the ground or surface of the soil are not well controlled with these mowers. So, and again, as I said early on in the video, mowing does not control prostrate weeds. So you do have prostrate types of weeds, grasses adapting to your mowing and cutting systems. Tillage again is another method that you can use for controlling weeds. Tillage has many other objectives. You're not just destroying weeds with tillage, but you're also preparing the soil, and while you prepare the soil or soil beds, you are in the process destroying weeds. So tillage has been an important component of, I should say, mechanical weed control in this case. And when you use tillage equipments, you are burying the weed seeds, you're separating the shoots from the roots, and sometimes you may actually stimulate the seeds in the seed bank to germinate, and then you can control them by another tillage pass. And you can dry the shoots and kill them, and also exhaust the carbohydrate reserves that are in perennial weeds. So tillage has multiple benefits for weed control. But in recent years, tillage is being reduced for soil quality reasons. So the disadvantage with tillage is you can't till the crop rows because you will also destroy the crop. And there are regulations around dust pollution, air pollution, so you have to be aware of that. Tillage is always an issue if you have sloping soils or soils that are prone to erosion, and can be costly, and sometimes you can bring the weed seed banks lower in the seed profile up into the soil surface from where they emerge and cause problems. So there are disadvantages to tillage as well. So let me just point this out. This is research done in Canada, where you can see that the tillage equipments can change the vertical distribution of weed seeds in the soil seed bank. If you're using a moldboard plow, you are sending the weed seeds deeper into the soil profile as low as 6 inches, 4 to 6 inches, and you can see like almost 2/3 of your weed seed bank is in that zone from where they don't emerge. Very little, or at least in this case 12% of the weed seeds are on the surface from where they germinate. And now compare that to no-till, where you're not burying the weed seeds, so you have 90% of the weed seeds on the top 2 inches of the soil from where they emerge. So seed bank management becomes even more important if you're using a reduced tillage system. So the goal here would be, again, not to allow the weeds to set seeds. So there are different kinds of tillage equipments, and I'm not going to describe them in detail, but you have the moldboard plows, the disc plows. Now all of them have their benefits and negative aspects as well. So again, these tools have been designed for different purposes, and if one tillage tool was able to get rid of all the weeds, we would be using only one tillage tool. But the weeds adapt to different systems. That is why many different tools have been designed for weed control depending on what species you have. So again, this is another system or another method, chisel plows. Now you got to be aware that if you have perennial weeds in your system, those with rhizomes and tubers and all that, you may actually make the problem worse by dragging those to different parts of the field and spreading them around. So you have to be careful with that as well. Here's another plow. In this case, it's called a sweep plow or noble plow. So many different types of equipment are out there for controlling weeds, and we just saw some of these tools. And here's another one that is very common, you've probably seen it, field cultivators, again used for weed control. So here's another tool that is being used in between the beds for weed control, in this case tomatoes. So there are many different tools, mechanical tools for weed control. And again, I want to emphasize that each of these tools have their benefits and disadvantages. So you have to select the tools based on your specific situation. Lilliston rolling type cultivator, which is used quite a fair bit in the Central Valley, is a sled mounted cultivator for vegetable production used in the Salinas Valley. And let me come to the more exciting new developments that have emerged over the last few years, and these are precision guided cultivators that have cameras on them, and they are very precise. So here's an example of a split knife weeder, and you can see how close they go to the crop within the crop row and actually remove the weeds. So these equipment are designed to get very close to the crop row or the crop line and remove the weeds. So they have cameras and computer systems that help them do that. Here's another look at what is called a weed spider. Here's another one from Vision Robotics. Then we have what we call finger weeders. What we see here is a new robotic technology developed in France by a company called Nio Technologies. The robot is remotely controlled and it does not need a tractor to pull along, and as you will see in a moment, the robot is equipped with finger weeders and it can cultivate the crop rows. All of it is being remotely controlled and the system is very precise, and this is one of the newer technologies. Now we saw another finger cultivator earlier, but that particular cultivator was pulled by a tractor. This one is fully autonomous, and as you get closer you can see the finger weeders in action, and it's, as I said, fully robotic. Continuing on the theme of robotic weed control, here is a laser weeder developed by Carbon Robotics, and when I play the video you can see laser beams striking the weed. Actually the machine has cameras that can detect the weed and it zaps the weed by sending a laser. You probably cannot see the beam, but you can see the weed as it is being burnt by the laser. So let me put this in action, and you can clearly see the weeds that are being hit with the laser and smoke coming out from the weeds that have been burnt or hit with the laser. Here is the same machine from another angle, and when I play this video and put this in action, you can see actually the flash of light that's coming through, and that's the laser. And as you can see, the weeds are being burnt with the laser beam. So again, this is from carbon robotics, a laser weeder. Here is another innovation in robotic weed control, or I should say mechanical weed control. And in this case, it's an electric weeder, and you can see the three heads that are visible in this slide here. These have solenoids or electricity generating heads that that emit electricity, and once it touches a weed either in between the rows or any weeds that are above the crop canopy, it sends an electric current and kills the weed. So such a machine is being tested at Cornell University, and when I put this in action, you can see how this machine operates. And as you can see, it is zapping the weeds above the crop canopy as well as those that are in between the crop rows. So again, this is an electric weeder. So far, we have discussed and seen examples of cultural weed control and physical or mechanical weed control, but there is also the third method of weed control called biological weed control, in which we use animals, insects, or pathogens to control weeds. Now, the most common method or most popular method is the use of animals or insects for weed control. And these animals could be domesticated animals such as sheep, goats, chicken, or even geese, or sometimes non-domesticated animals. Biological control may be easier to conduct in non-crop situations. In crop situations, you have to be careful as the animals can also hurt the crop. But nevertheless, it is an important weed control method. As I was saying, insects have also been used for weed control as a biocontrol agent, and in this example or in this slide you can see a weevil that has been used for the control of puncture vine, which is a common summer weed in our cropping systems in California. And there are examples of pathogens, but there are lesser known examples of such being used in cropping systems. So hopefully I gave you an overview of what integrated weed management is, and now you are able to use some of the concepts or learn some of the concepts about integrated weed management in vegetable systems. Again, although I mentioned vegetable cropping systems, these principles have more applications for other cropping systems as well. So I hope that was a good overview of integrated weed management in vegetable production systems. Thank you.